all so much for coming along today for this conversation with the wonderful Annabel Crabb. I am Edwina Throsby and I run the Talks and Ideas program here. And I was actually thinking about this the other day. One of the benefits of my job, I suppose, is that it has a very high clang factor. I get to meet a lot of extremely clever and well-known people. And I was thinking about this yesterday because I was at a family gathering for the birthday of my Auntie Barb. And
happy birthday, Auntie Barb.
Yes, thank you. I'm sure she'll appreciate that. And my Auntie Barb is a hard woman to impress. So, like, for example, I said to her a while ago, hey, we've got Ottolenghi coming to the Opera House to give an event.
Come on, that's a real Auntie Barb slayer, I would have thought.
She was like, I don't really care for his salads.
Said no one ever.
And then, right? And another time, I was like, Auntie Barb, I met Hillary Clinton this week. And she said, yeah, what a disappointment she turned out to be. But yesterday, at this thing, when I told her what I was doing today, coming to talk to you, she lost her mind.
I knew I liked Auntie Barb.
She was like, oh, that Annabel Crabb, she's so clever. She's the sort of person that if you had to spend a long time with her, you know you'd never run out of anything to talk about. So I'm sure that we're not going to run out of things to talk about today, and I also sincerely hope, Annabel, that you never find yourself on a long-haul flight seated next to Auntie Barb.
I'll know exactly how to proceed. I know which topics are off the menu as well.
So we're here today to talk about Annabel's recently written and released quarterly essay called Men at Work, The Parenthood Trap in Australia, which is an extension, I suppose, of your book from a few years ago, The Wife Drought, in which you made a very convincing case that men in public life benefit disproportionately from the unrecognised and often unpaid labour of their female partners, and that relationship isn't reciprocated typically across gender lines. So I was wondering, Annabel, with this essay, what direction did you want to progress that argument into, and why now?
Well, I wanted to progress my relationship with the editor of Quarterly Essay, Chris Fike, beyond the point where he was constantly emailing me asking me to write a quarterly essay. Like most writers, I'm a sort of slumbering, lazy person that really has to be jabbed repeatedly to jump into action again. Sorry, that's probably a bit unfair on both of us. But I think when I wrote The Wife Drought, one of the puzzles that I was left with was, what's the deal with men, right? Like, because one of the things that... I mean,
and she gets it all into a book this size.
It's less awful than it seems. But, I mean, one thing that amazed me just looking into the history of women and work in Australia is just how incredibly women in Australia have transformed our lives over the last 50 years. I mean, it's been amazing. Our move into the workplace and our, on average, retention of a lot of what we were already doing kind of in the home, and there's a lot of juggling. Lots and lots of women in Australia work part-time, for instance. Australia's got a really, really strong part-time work culture, and most of that is women. So something like 45% of Australian mothers work part-time, only about 4 or 5% of Australian fathers. So that's the kind of, that's this disparity. But, when I was researching The Wife Drought, I had some people who would say, mate, no man wants to look after their own kids, and anyone who says they do is just lying to you, right? No, people will argue that. And Edith Gray, who did this really interesting research on the behaviour of fathers of new babies, found that they, on average in Australia, work about 5 hours a week more after the birth of their first child than they did beforehand.
Who wants to get home at 6 o'clock?
Well, I mean, that's why I do say this, in the essay. I mean, I can rationally understand that, if you have the choice between, a nice, predictable working environment where, you put a pen down and it stays there, and there's sort of work
and people
surfaces,
appreciate you,
and there's you get positive feedback and, money and stuff like that. I mean, I guess, or you can go home and be there for the moment when the, juvenile attention span and the adult stock of patients expire within 15 minutes of each other, just as the sun goes down. But, see, I don't believe that. I don't think that's right. I kind of at the end of the wife drought said, well, look, I think that there are definitely forces at work, in the Australian workplace that do encourage men to be this ideal employee, whatever else is going on in their lives. And that's what fuels what they call the fatherhood premium, which is that men who are fathers are considered more employable, more reliable, more promotable than women who are mothers. And nowhere is that presumption in Australia more radically and clearly demonstrated than it is in that great NatSem modelling from a few years back, which found that they worked out what a 25-year-old man embarking on an average career, 40 years in an average paying job, what he could expect to make over the life course, and they calculated that that guy would make $2 million over his career, but if he had kids, it'd be 2.5 million. Whereas a woman, same qualifications, same skills, 25-year-old, starting out on an average career, could expect to earn 1.9 million over that 40 years, but if she had kids, it went down to 1.3, I think, 1.3. So that's how the same kind of biological event, becoming a parent, can have massively different effects on the lives of two working people, depending on what gender they are. So I wanted to I found that when I was writing The Wife Drought, I was fascinated with women and what happens to women and how this intersection of home life and work life leads to very specific results in each of those spheres. But what I wanted to do with this essay was to look at men and just look at, okay, and not in a kind of like, oi, you, pick up after yourself sort of way, but in a kind of like, okay, well, so why is it that, after 50 years of really significant change in, the women that they still statistically very commonly live with and interbreed with, I don't ever assume that every relationship in Australia is heterosexual, but it's still quite a common lineup, right? So I wanted to have a look at, well, what are the pressures? Because one thing that I really learnt from The Wife Drought is that the things that dictate people's behaviour at work are never contained in the HR manual, right? We make our decisions about what we do at work based on a whole bunch of other stuff. Whatever else is going on in the rest of our lives, what are the people around me doing, how do I see others behaving? And so I wanted to look at what the impact was of those sorts of assumptions on men's behaviour in a loving way.
It's like we've got three sort of things that are interplaying, right? We've got the politics around this, we've got the legal situation around this, and I think most importantly we have the culture. Yeah. And I think that's what you kind of get into in this essay.
And all of those elements have little teeth and claws that dig themselves into the flesh of men and make them behave in a certain way. That's right.
So, one of in your essay, you take a jaunty little stroll down the history of paid parental leave in Australia, and that was really interesting. And I'd quite like to start there because I was super surprised by that. I actually didn't realise how discriminatory, really, the discrimination laws are.
Yeah.
So would you mind just giving us a little...
I would love to. Settle down, children. I wrote quite a bit in The Wife Drought about Australia's old legislation that was called the marriage bar, and that was the federal legislation. It was legislated in the 1920s, I think, that prohibited female Commonwealth public servants from keeping their jobs after they got married. So for a long time in Australia, if you worked for the federal public service and you got married, you were legislatively obliged to quit your job. And we held on to that legislation for ages. The UK had a similar legislation and they ditched theirs in about the 1940s, but for some reason we just hung on to ours for years and years and years. And in fact, it wasn't abolished until 1966. So, like, there would be people in this room who had an impact that had an impact on their lives. Anyway, imagine the absolute crick in the neck these women who were Commonwealth public servants got when 6 years after that ridiculous law was repealed, in came the Whitlam government. In 1972, Whitlam legislated a Commonwealth maternity leave scheme. So, and all of a sudden it was like, hey ladies, don't worry about quitting your jobs, go ahead, have those babies, and you can have 12 weeks of paid maternity leave. 1972. And also up to a year of unpaid leave. So it was an extraordinary change, and it was because Whitlam was trying to bring Australia into line with international ILO conventions, which had been avoided by the governments preceding him. And so that extended this sort of blueprint. It kind of introduced the idea that women should have the right to return to work after taking time out of the workforce to have their children. But it also established this sort of assumption in Australia that a year was probably about the right amount of time to be out of the workforce if you're having a baby, which has gone on to become quite a powerful presumption in lots of ways. And then, so that percolated away, and you had the private sector kind of coming around and offering private maternity leave provisions in a sort of hodgepodge sort of way.
And at this point it was only for women too, right?
Right, yeah, it was maternity leave. And so this is how, you know, culture changes. And then decades later, when Jenny Macklin, who had been battling for a long time to get her own party to adopt the notion of a paid parental leave scheme that would be available to all taxpayers, not just public servants, she finally got the Labor Party conference over the line on that. It was not an easy process. Some of the resistance to these programs, both kind of back in the 60s and 70s and through to the early 2000s, was led by kind of, well, conservative union leaders in some part and
The
colleagues in the Labor
unions.
Right, yeah. So, but anyway, Jenny Macklin eventually managed to legislate the current paid parental leave scheme right in the middle of the global financial crisis. I mean, it's quite an extraordinary thing that she pulled off. And now, I think, we are aware of the fact that that scheme is absolutely dominated by women. So in the, 8.5 years that it's been legislated, the Commonwealth Paid Parental Leave Scheme, which is 18 weeks at the minimum wage, it's means tested, and it's done amazing things, particularly for low-paid women who otherwise would not have been offered parental leave by their employers. So, I mean, it's been an extraordinary thing for a great number of women. But in that time, it's been taken up by 1.2 million women, which is lots, and in that time it's been taken up by 6,250 men. So less than 1/2%. Now, the way that scheme works is if you're the birth mother, you apply for it and then you can transfer it to anybody else, you know, your partner, but it really does not happen very often. It's quite tricky to do. And there's a secondary scheme called dad and partner pay, so you're absolutely sure about who the primary caregiver isn't going to be. And that's been taken up by about, I think, 300,000 or 400,000. So even if you kind of assume that in these relationships the mum is taking paid parental leave and the dad is taking dad and partner pay, there's not as big a take-up among men of that secondary scheme, which is 2 weeks.
There's an issue too with the language around that because the idea of primary and secondary carers, you can see why it was introduced, right? To make space for same-sex couples, to recognise that families do this sort of juggle, but at the same time, we're evolving to a point where that language isn't perhaps as useful as...
Well, yeah, I talked to Jenny Macklin about this, and she said, well, look, yeah, we called it primary carer so that, you know, it wasn't she said like that we wanted women to have an opportunity to recover from childbirth, but we didn't want to be exclusive of same-sex couples, so its primary carer is the way that we've described it. But over the years that term's been used, I think that there is a bit of a shorthand that's evolved, which means that's the birth mother. And it's really interesting the way, even though a lot of private sector parental leave schemes are similarly directed to the primary carer, there's no gendered language being used, and yet when men apply for it, they do experience a bit of blowback. Now, in the States, there's been this really interesting series of legal cases over the last few years. I mean, the most recent one that was publicised was JP Morgan Chase, was sued by a broker who was a guy who applied for parental leave, and they refused it unless he could provide evidence that his wife was so unable on mental... Incapacitated is exactly the word I was looking for. Thank you. Or debilitated. Maybe that's what I was going for. Anyway, so he sued them. I mean, they settled, and then they ended up setting up a fund to compensate other men that they'd rejected, because they were, even though the language was gender neutral, they were saying, but really this is for women, not for men.
And it's not just the gender neutrality of the language, it's the implication of a hierarchy as well.
Right, yeah, and this idea that if you've got two parents of a child, you've got to pick a lane. Like, who's the one who's doing everything, and who's the one who's basically a sort of helping person that is just a bit like boop 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 boop. And it's sort of, it's funny because it's so entrenched, and yet, and I know heaps of families that don't work like that, but it's sort of something that we've got to all fit into in some way. And the interesting thing about Australia, because I was reading about all these American cases and thinking, right, well, there must be, why haven't I read about any cases in Australia? Surely there must be some pissed off dads that have, had a bit of a go. And I rang the Equal Opportunity why can't I think Commissioner? Why can't I think of words at the moment? Kate Jenkins, lovely lady. And I said, I can't find any case law about this. And she said, oh, no, you won't, probably, because it's legal to discriminate against fathers in matters of parental leave and whatever. And I'm like, what? Oh, yes, it is. So the Sex Discrimination Act, which was drafted in 1984, and very hard one by Susan Ryan, a great reformer in the Hawke government, Section 31 says nothing in this anti-discrimination legislation prevents any employer from making special provisions for women in the area of childcare and childbirth and so on. So at the time, that legislation was drafted, it was addressing all of these issues that were being faced by women in the midst of this great flow into the Australian workforce. And I think one of its unforeseen consequences is that it does really devalue the idea, or not even take account of the idea that a man might be a primary carer of a child, or might want to be, or might be wanting to move in and out of the workplace in the same way that women have become really good at doing over the last few decades. And I do think that's outdated. I could not possibly quantify among Australian fathers how many are the kind of like, oh my God, I'm not going down there until everybody's asleep, and how many are, feeling a bit sad that they miss out on stuff, or that they can't work flexibly or change the way that they work to match the other stuff that's going on in their lives. But it really bugs me that I think men are, in many workplaces, still prevented from finding that out. And that's what I'm writing about in this essay. The Diversity Council of Australia did some really interesting research recently among millennial fathers, and what they discovered was that there was a really significant desire among millennial dads to work differently, to work flexibly, to to have more involvement in their kids' lives than their own fathers had, and yet the gap between aspiration and reality was quite significant. So, for instance, I think was 79% of them wanted to work a compressed work week, where you work like the absolute clappers and then you leave early on another day, or have a day off or whatever. And but only about 25% of them were actually doing it. And my view is that, based on the research that I've done, that Australian men feel and they rationally fear adverse consequences should they try to work with the same flexibility that women commonly do.
And there's a justification to that fear, really, isn't there, with the way things are set
Yep.
up?
Yeah, there are. Bain did some research, I think 2 or 3 years ago, that established that men's requests for flexible work were about twice as likely to be rejected as women's. Also, the experience of men who work flexibly in Australia, again, in this Bain research, demonstrated they have a different experience from the one that women have. The Equal Opportunity Commission did a huge report on pregnancy and return to work in 2014, and they had a chunk of research too on fathers that had taken parental leave, and about 25% of them reported harassment or ill treatment of some kind on their return to work, ranging from, just adverse comments to all the way to dismissal. And I think it's very true in Australia that while we expect women to change the way that they work when their family obligations, not even just having children, but, caring for elderly relatives or sick family members or whatever, we are prepared to countenance women changing the way they work much more than we are prepared to countenance men who do the same thing.
Well, I mean, even the notion of a career path for a woman is relatively new,
Right,
And I think that, this points to a couple of things, I think. I think it's about the way that we value, traditionally female-valued, female-performed work, and how we don't value the caring economy at all. But I think it's, when I was reading your essay, I was thinking about this kind of, this entrenched public-private binary, right? That it's been only a few decades that women are increasingly more tolerated in public life, and there's a bit of distance to go there yet, but it's not like people don't kind of freak out at the idea of a most people. But the reverse can't really be said. When you are a stay-at-home dad, there's this kind of double reaction. Like, on one hand, it's like, you are amazing. Look at that boy look at that man with his little baby. Isn't he amazing?
Let me just make you a casserole. I think I'm ovulating. All that.
Let me just. But then there's also this kind of, it's a bit emasculating. What's going on? His wife must be a real career bitch, or like there are all of these kinds of narratives around that are kind of deeply negative. I mean, how do you negotiate that as a guy that wants to spend time with your family? How do you...
Well, it's like any other social, cultural assumption. It's really only changed... you can't really legislate for it. That's the awkward thing. You can't really pass laws saying, from now on, nobody will think it's weird for a bloke to take parental leave. It's just... But the way that it changes is through workplaces, generally. I have had a look at a couple of big companies in the essay who have changed their policies and achieved a change in behaviour pretty quickly. And it's because, we are herd animals, we're sensible. We don't believe governments that tell us how to behave a certain way. We don't even really believe what's written down in the HR manual. What we do notice is the way other people behave, and the stuff that other people get away with without an anvil dropping on them from the sky. And so I always think that, governments can tweak, they can create a legislative environment that allows people to behave in certain ways or feel free to, but really it's workplaces that set the tone, and that tone is often set by senior people in a workplace, and also watching other people kind of get away with it. you know.
So what sort of tweaks, because what sort of tweaks can you make? Is it around the sort of language that you use to describe? Is it around making paid leave compulsory? What sort of levers do you have to pull?
So in Australia, our paid parental leave scheme it's unlike some of those big European schemes that people weep about in, Norway and Sweden and so on, because we don't have the same kind of welfare sector. We don't have a kind of like a social insurance approach to welfare. So our scheme is publicly funded. It is set at the minimum wage and it's means tested, so it's very targeted, and it is not enough money to be like a serious kind of option for a replacement breadwinner wage in some families, right? So it has that difference from the European schemes. But one of the tweaks that have been used in a bunch of countries, and I write about this in the essay, is just making a certain chunk of the paid parental leave only available if the non-birth parent takes it, right? And
as well as the birth parent, or you make your own decisions.
You make a bit of it, use it or lose it.
Yeah.
And that's actually a really intelligent little bit of a tweak, because if you assume that, you've got to know and understand the behaviour of the people who are eligible for the scheme that you're designing, right? And we know that in Australia we still have a really quite deep-seated male breadwinner model, like as our kind of default mechanism. And we know that men feel as though they are responsible for earning the money and breadwinning and being reliable and so on. That is, shown again and again. And that's something that men feel not only at work but also at home, like in a lot of circumstances. And so if you can actually organise a scheme that allows them, that doesn't violate that sense of identity, but also brings an added benefit to the home that is tied to changing that behaviour, then that's an intelligent way of doing it. This is how I can both be present with my family and provide at the same time. That's kind of quite an intelligent tweak that has changed behaviour quite significantly in Germany, Sweden, Norway. Canada, if we're sort of anxious about talking about European countries, or Scandinavia, which is always just annoyingly good at this stuff. I went to this conference once, and the Norwegian ambassador, I think she's now been repatriated, but her name's Uni Kluvstad, and she was giving a talk at this conference that I went to about the Norwegian system. And she was talking about, we have excellent childcare, and it's childcare expenses are capped at, 300 euros a month. And there was this kind of like moan of longing. Kind of like all these Australian women in the audience were like, oh, that was so good. And
$300 a month.
A month, yeah. Most of these people in the audience would have spent that on, parking fees for dropping off their kids. But Canada did this really interesting thing where just Quebec changed their approach to the public paid parental leave scheme. The rest of Canada just sailed on exactly the same with the same scheme, but Quebec changed their model and they introduced a use it or lose it chunk of paid parental leave that was only available if the dad took it, right? And so you had this amazing kind of study with a control, and because Canada also does this brilliant, and we've done it a bit in Australia, but we tend to drop it every time we get into budgetary trouble, which is regularly, so we do it peripatetically, and it's quite annoying if you're a social researcher because it's bloody awesome information. This is the time use diary where you get like thousands of families to fill out a really kind of insanely detailed account of their time, and that's the only way we really have of measuring domestic work, because we don't do any other sort of measury thing like pay for it, so it's sort of the diaries are really useful. It helps you plot over time what the change in the share of domestic work is. I mean, on the statistical upside, Australia hasn't changed all that much, so it's kind of like maybe we didn't miss out on that much intel. But in Canada, they've done really good time-use diaries, so they could actually work out not only what the change in behaviour among Quebec dads was under this new scheme, but they also could work out whether there were like knock-on effects for things like share of domestic work and the behaviour of women in terms of employment participation. And what they discovered was, yes, creating this use it or lose it model in Quebec did sharply increase the number of dads who took longer parental leave, but it also found that among those families, the mums went back to work earlier and they went on to have a more even division of labour within the home. Now, there's heaps of research around that shows that even if dads take quite a short period of parental leave with a new baby, that their connection with that child is deeper over their life course, and also that they are involved more in domestic work. So this is where, you know, the experiences early in the life of a child can actually have quite significant knock-on effects.
Well, because there's this sort of assumption culturally that the act of pushing a baby out through your vagina sort of magically confers the knowledge of how to parent that baby to
Whereas
you.
the lived experience is, of course, that everyone's an idiot with a newborn. Like, nobody...
This is it.
There's this whole... But women just know. Sorry, we just do not.
We don't.
Yeah.
We really, really don't.
No, at all. And the truth is that the really significant learning curve, like when there's a new baby, is in the first few months, like where you work out...
When you're not killing it.
Right.
Yeah.
Where you just like, whoa, and like cardigans, how do you put those on? Like, it's so like... all of that stuff. And then it gets into all this other complicated stuff like, you know, who's allergic to nuts in the friendship group of this kid, like whose birthday is it on Saturday, later is it Mufti Day, you know, all of that stuff. And because in this country, thanks to Gough in 1972, there is like still quite a strong tradition that women will take a year off. And Kate Jenkins actually made this point to me, which I'd never really considered before, but she said, look, I think that it creates a bit of a presumption that that's how long, you know, maternity leave is. And a lot of stuff happens in that time. So, for instance, in the orthodox arrangement, the mum gets really, really good at doing all of the kids' stuff, and also has really, like, because she's at home, has taken on, you know, a whole heap of the additional domestic work that arises with a kid as well. And so at the end, it's just like, oh my God, I can't go back to work full time, you know. So
right.
It sort of helps to perpetuate that model. And, you know, most dads who are, you know, at home for tops 2 weeks kind of go back to work, and then all of the learning and the expertise is amassed at home in their absence. And that, look, it really plays a big role in determining what happens next time there's a baby as well, because next time, not only does the mum have this incredible bank of knowledge, but she probably also has a much lower income this time around too, making it a total no-brainer who'll be, you know, doing all that next time around. Now, I don't sort of say this, make this point because I've recently been accused of disdaining the work of the home, which I don't. I bloody love the work of the home. Like, I mean, you know, I do heaps of it and I don't try and get out of it. But I do think, too, that, I mean, people should be free, or families should be free to organise their lives in the way that best suit them. And, like, heaps of times it makes sense for one person to be the breadwinner and for the other person to, you know, take responsibility for more of the domestic stuff. But our culture assumes that that will be a man-woman arrangement, like that it's a gender thing, when really, I mean, it should be a practical thing where all people are different, you know. Everybody should be able to make up their minds about how they're going to operate their own lives without these sort of overarching assumptions that are imposed by history.
How does it play out in same-sex families? Do we have...
Well, that is really interesting. There is, like, not a great amount of research available yet, but what there's a little bit in the States. It suggests that people do, they do divide up into breadwinners and homemakers, to a significant degree. But of course, it's just not along gender lines. They just do it on the basis of, well, who's in what job, and whose job has more flexibility, whose job has a better parental leave scheme, and all of that stuff, which kind of makes sense, But in heterosexual couples, there is an additional assumption about who that should probably be. There's this great, a really interesting piece of research done at Adelaide University just last year. The lead researcher was Ashley Borgqvist, and this team did some really in-depth interviews with quite a small number of men about what guided their behaviour and the observations they made about their own experiences. And I mean, most of these men they talked to did vary their work in some way to account for their children. But to the extent that they did, they viewed it as a workplace privilege. I sometimes come in late because I read with my kid at school, but I'm allowed to get away with it because, I'm quite senior, or because I've got a good relationship with my boss. All of them talked about it like it was something they were kind of getting away with. Or they talked about, the fact that they were model employees so that they were afforded a little bit of flexibility. But there was this one guy, actually, who was talking about how he doesn't work flexibly, but his wife does, but his wife gets paid more than him. So he said, so really, I guess if we were being, economically rational about it, she would be working more hours and I would be being part-time. But I've worked my whole life to get to where I am in my job. So it'd be absolutely silly for me to go part-time. And it's so interesting because you hear so many women say, well, my salary won't cover the childcare or whatever, because that's the other weird thing about heterosexual couples in Australia. We somehow hypothecate childcare costs to the woman's income, which is weird because, there's no other household expense that is directly tied to the woman's income. You hear it all the time, people saying, I can't, if I go back to work, my salary will barely cover the childcare. But you don't ever hear, people saying, we're thinking about getting a tent because my share of the income doesn't cover the, mortgage or whatever. It's sort of interesting. And stuff like that, you don't really think about until you really have it spelled out, and then you think, that is weird, isn't it? Why are we like that? I don't know, funny humans, yeah.
And one of the things that you say is that it used to really annoy you hearing female CEOs be interviewed, and how they'd always be asked, how do you juggle it? How do you... And you'd get enraged by that. But then you thought about it and realised, actually, it's a perfectly sensible question.
It's a bloody sensible question.
And the outrage is why we're not asking male CEOs how they juggle it.
I start the essay talking about the lovely discrepancy between our kind of the global heart attack we had when Jacinda Ardern got pregnant. Oh my God, how's that going to work? And, God, she has become this poster woman for parenthood and leadership. And yet, not much more than a year later, when we had those certain events in Canberra last August that ended, during a week in which we flirted with the idea of Prime Minister Dutton and then ended up, oh my gosh, with Prime Minister Morrison and Treasurer Frydenberg, which was an interesting event, or an interesting way for the week to pan out. Just ask Malcolm Turnbull. But the second that they were appointed by the party room, I thought, oh, that's interesting. With the first Pentecostal Prime Minister and Jewish Treasurer that we've ever had. Sort of ecclesiastically original, apart from anything else. But also, they both got little kids. So Scott Morrison has primary school age kids. Josh Frydenberg's are even younger. So his little boy was a toddler at the time, and a preschool age daughter. And I was just really interested to see that nobody asked them, how are you going to manage these giant jobs with these little kids? Because actually, hadn't happened since the mid-70s that a Prime Minister and a Treasurer both at the same time had little kids. That was like Fraser Howard was the last time that was the case. So I found that really interesting, and I kind of griped about that for a bit, and then I thought, well, come on, you could always just ask them. So I did. Just after giving myself 3 or 4 weeks of moaning about it, I then did ask them. And it was interesting because as soon as I asked them, it was just really, I mean, both of them are very attentive fathers. I'm not saying they're anything but. They're both unusually besotted with their kids, so I'm not saying they're not loving fathers. But it was really obvious that neither of them had really been asked the question before, because you see, you ask a working mum who's senior, or people get this question all the time. I mean, I know I get asked it all the time. How do you manage everything? And because it is a good question to ask. But so, most of us have got this sort of, little laminated card in our purses that says, well, here's how it works, like Mondays are like this, Tuesdays are like that, Wednesdays I have a heart attack most weeks, and, mine is all about, I mean, my partner works a half day from home once a week, which is awesome. And we divide up domestic tasks in a way that is pleasing to me, i.e. he does laundry and school forms, I do cooking and, more school pickups because I can work more flexibly. Anyway, blah, 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 boring. But both those guys were super rusty with this question because it was sort of like, well, we do Skype as much as we can. And I mean, it's sort of like how to catch up with your kids rather than, oh my God, who does all this stuff?
Well, this is the thing, and this is what struck me reading it, is that it wasn't just that they were sort of unprepared for the question, having not been asked it much. It was like they kind of couldn't understand what you were asking.
Yeah, actually.
Like the whole framework of the question was foreign.
Yeah. What do you mean? Yeah.
Right, exactly. Answering like, oh, we Skype is lovely, but it wasn't the question. The question was...
Yeah, and the answer really is, I have this amazing wife who, and heaps of the Australian political history is based on men being in office supported by incredibly capable spouses. And this is, this is ground that I covered in the wife drought, because having a spouse who doesn't work full-time or doesn't do work in the paid workforce is like a total goldmine. That is a professional asset because it means you can work long hours in this absolute confidence and knowledge that your kids are being looked after in a way that means you don't have to look at the clock and think, oh God, it's 10 to 5, I've got to go, And that is an amazing thing to have. It's a great asset. And after a lot of chasing about in the wife drought, I eventually established the answer to the question that I went into writing the book with, which is like, what proportion of working dads in Australia have a spouse that works part-time or is full-time at home compared to full-time working Australian mums? That's what I wanted to know. And I couldn't find it for ages. Like I did this sort of lazy journo Googling. Oh, I couldn't find that. All right. Went into the census data, poked around, and I could find out, how many men were working part-time and full-time and at home full-time, and how many women were, working full-time, part-time, or not in the paid workforce. But what I wanted to know was, which of you people are married to each other? That's what I wanted to know. And Jenny Baxter, who's a great researcher at the Australian Institute of Family Studies, who I cite a lot in this and also in the wife drought, eventually went to work with her software and her giant brain and kind of established the figure that I was looking for, which is that 76% of full-time Australian dads, full-time working Australian dads, have a spouse that works either part-time or not at all in the paid workforce. 76%.
Wow.
I know, right? And then, and the corresponding proportion of women, like full-time working mums with the same arrangement, is 15. So that's how it kind of explains a lot of stuff that you see in the workplace. Because if you're both, lawyers and you're incompetent, you're both wanting to be partner or whatever, and you've got 2 kids, and one of you's a man, one of you's a woman, one of you is 5 times more likely than the other, statistically speaking, to have someone like picking up the dry cleaning and, the mufti day and all of that stuff, which is pretty amazing. Like, that's a pretty solid advantage in the workplace.
It really, really is. The other thing that I think is interesting in all of this is that there's often, I think, an assumption that the staying home with the kids is you're just all playing, you're going to the park and you're reading books and you're drawing pictures, and isn't it lovely? And if I were to not be at work doing that, it'd be a bit of a bludge.
Yeah, there is that feeling. And even when we were back at the 2014 election, which election was that? Oh my God, my brain.
More words.
When Tony Abbott was pitching his parental leave scheme, which was going to be a much more European-style one, remember, it was quietly...
It was 2013.
It was quietly strangled by his colleagues who were horrified. It was going to be funded by a tax on big business, and they were like, oh God, what? But he'd had this big epiphany because he'd gone from, there'll be paid parental leave in Australia over my dead body. And then I think all of his daughters then became of working age. He was like, oh, dear God, it's terrible, quick. So he then unveiled this incredible sort of European-style paid parental leave scheme, which eventually bit the dust. But in that election campaign, there was a debate where this guy asked a question. He was a truck driver from maybe Rooty Hill or wherever nearby where this debate was being held, and he said, and it was amazing, I'll never forget it, this question, because it articulated something deeply felt, in the Australian psyche. He said, well, I'm all for parental leave, but why should I be paying taxes so that some pretty little lawyer on the North Shore can have a baby? And that was his view. And I thought, oh yeah, it's interesting because there is this assumption that, paying for somebody to look after a child or have a child is a bit of a bloody bludge. It's a bit of a bludge. Anyway, so yeah, it's the interesting thing is, I do have a talk in the essay to a couple of organisations that have made big changes to their paid parental leave schemes and brought about some big changes in behaviour. And I've talked to some people that men that have taken parental leave and a serious chunk of it. And it's interesting that, they report people around them going a bit mate, bit of a lurk, isn't it? And they're like, wow, I had no idea how hard it was until I was in amongst it, right? And I think the longer that men spend on parental leave, the more aware they are about what goes into, raising babies. And the evidence suggests that they come out of that with a greater tendency to engage more in the work of the home.
Well, this is the thing, but it's got a knock-on effect to the workplace as well, right?
Sure.
So people go back to work, men have reported to go back to work with higher levels of empathy, better organisational skills. There is no person more efficient in the workplace than the person that has to make the daycare pick up by 6 o'clock.
Right, yeah. That's true. Look, and a lot of these changes are happening in sort of big white-collar organisations because they're the ones that are moving towards flexible work. They are the ones that are intensely competitive with each other for talent, right? I was talking to someone from PwC and they've kind of implemented this flexible approach to work and changing their parental leave scheme. And I was talking to the diversity HR person there who was saying, oh, well, we are really competitive with other firms for talent. Part of the reason that we change our parental leave scheme is to attract people and also to retain great staff and keep them feeling satisfied to work at our organisation. She said, well, we're a millennial firm, essentially. I'm like, oh, really? What's your average age? 27. So,
So why do you think that the private sector is leading in this area?
A couple of reasons. I think that there is, particularly in the leadership of these big firms, I think there's a strong role played by leaders like Liz Broderick, the previous Equal Opportunity Commissioner, who did a huge amount of work targeting C-suite executives, specifically men, in these big organisations. And she did something diabolical, actually, like so clever, I mean, appallingly clever in many ways. And that is, because traditionally things like, gender equity was a thing that women argued for as a sort of like, this is the fair thing to do. And so in every sort of big company, you'd have some nagging woman who's like, what about the men? Why aren't there more women? They'd be like, oh, yeah, maybe appoint another woman, keep her quiet, whatever. But what's happened, I think, in the last decade is that the argument or the workplace debate about gender equity has become much more of a business case model thing. So there's a heap more research into not just, gender equity as a fair thing to do, but also as a smart thing to do, as you have more and more resources sunk into research into whether diverse organisations make better decisions and do better in business, and there is an overwhelming weight of evidence to suggest that's the case. I think there's also now, particularly among these sort of professional services firms, there's a real race on for talent and a great emphasis on retaining good staff. And if you can build confidence and earn the respect and trust of an employee by showing them some trust and allowing them to integrate their work and family life better, then you end up with a more engaged employee who's less likely to skip off and accept a better offer. And I have to say too, there is some rather dreadful research that indicates that if you give people flexibility to organise their life and work in a way that decreases the stress of that interaction, they're actually capable of doing more hours of work a week. There's a very frightening huge IBM study into what they call the break point, which is literally the point at which your work and family obligations escalate to the point where you openly break down and start drinking cooking sherry in the afternoons. Like it's sort of like, and it's something like 60 hours a week or something. I'm making up the numbers here. I can't remember exactly what the numbers were, but they worked out that if parents who were allowed to work flexibly could then increase their breakpoint hours by like another 20 hours a week, or like they could do heaps more work if they were allowed to just do it while crying in their pajamas. Now I'm not sure that that's an awesomely healthy thing, but certainly, flexible work has a lot of advantages for big employers because they, if you're hot desking, you're not taking up as much real estate, and you can actually squeeze more work out of people before they have a mental breakdown.
The capacity for exploitation.
Yes, I know. Yeah. It's kind of like, so that's the seamy underbelly of this area of enterprise. But there you go.
So we are going to be taking questions this afternoon. So if you do have a question that you would like to ask Annabel, if you could start making your way to either one of these microphones, which are down the bottom of the staircase.
Shall I talk about the graph while they're shuffling to the microphones? There's one graph in this essay. I hate graphs, so there's only one.
You can tell she's from South Australia because she says graph.
That's right. I also say dance and chance. So this is a graph that was assembled by the aforementioned Jenny Baxter from the Australian Institute of Family Studies. And this is a graph, I can't show it to you because it's little on the page, but
you'll have to buy the essay.
If you do buy the essay, flip to page 11 and let it rock your world. It's a comparative average graph of what happens to mothers and fathers' employment hours, parenting and childcare hours, and housework hours upon the birth of their first child. It is breathtaking. And when Jenny first unveiled it to some conference, everyone was just like, oh. So there you go, page 11, feel the love.
It is. The numbers are shocking. I've just got one more question for you, which is, looking forward, with the sort of increase of the gig economy
Yeah.
and people increasingly not working with the big companies that are likely to be,
Yeah.
or the public service organisations that might be sort of offering this sort of leave.
Yeah.
How do you think that we need to manage that from a policy perspective? Is there a way that we can deal with people that, are the Uber drivers or
Well, it's a really tricky one because the kind of casualisation of a big chunk of the workforce,
which impacts on women disproportionately as well.
Sure, and it has, all of the advantages that we look for in flexible work, which is the capacity to ratchet up and down your work hours as and when it suits you, but it also is kind of a super low security environment and doesn't help with what is extraordinarily plain as a big problem for women when they spend more time out of the workforce than their male partners, which is just terrible, terrible superannuation down the track. I mean, the disparity between men and women in superannuation in this country is just shocking, and that is something that rolls on into a huge contribution to homelessness and poverty in later life for women.
And it feels like we're at a bit of a sort of, historical moment where there could be a will for change in this brewing, but that is kind of coming up against factors like the gig economy and like, the kind of decline of the union movement and those sorts of things. I mean, in your sort of ideal kind of Annabel created future.
God, do you think that would have much appeal? the sort of floppy Annabel for
but I mean, in terms of people, in this room who want to see, proper policy change and cultural change on this, what are we hoping for? How do we bring about a situation? Are we hoping for more generous government leave? Are we hoping for a shift in?
Look, I think that you could. The current paid parental leave scheme costs about $2 billion a year, so it's not cheap.
But it's also comparative to other OECD countries.
It is among the cheapest of the OECD countries. There is one OECD country that does not have a public paid parental leave scheme. It is the United States. That's not going to change anytime soon. Look, I mean, one thing that I haven't gone into this essay because it would be another essay entirely, is childcare. So that is a huge factor in the ability of people to incorporate work and family together. I mean, childcare is expensive and clumsy and awkward in Australia, and that is a huge crimp on participation of mothers. Yeah, that is something we could do. We could also retool the parental leave scheme, in my view. Maybe even just rename it, but anyway. We've got a question.
Yeah, microphone 2, please.
I assume this is on.
Yes. It's on.
Good.
You're good.
My name's Eleanor. I just wanted to ask about a slightly different situation. Mm-hmm. So my girlfriend took 12 months off to have her child, and she went back to work because she earned more money than her husband did.
Right.
And as a result, she actually ended up resenting him because he was spending a lot more time with their child than she was.
Yep.
And when her daughter got to about 4, she took another year off so that she could spend time with her before she went to school. And so I was just wondering if you had actually looked into the issue with regards to resentment on either side between men and women.
Oh, the headline is there's a stack of it.
Yeah, between men and women about, one going to work and the other person staying home and who's missing out on what.
Yeah. Oh, my God. There's resentment everywhere. I mean, ask anyone, about the sleep economy in a household with a little kid. You know that thing where the baby's crying and you both pretend to be asleep? You're like, pretty sure it's your turn. I'm pretty sure it's your turn. Anyway, but actually, you touch on something that is really, really interesting and is sort of an Australian phenomenon. I'll try and summarise this quickly because it's a massive field of research and it's really fascinating and a bit frightening. Because of the way that the way of our assumptions that our cultural system works sort of at a deeply baked in level in Australia, we do have this sort of male breadwinner model that is the norm. And so that when people violate it in some way by doing things differently, it can lead to knock-on resentments and insecurities and so on. So there's another researcher called Janine Baxter, not Jenny Baxter, Janine Baxter, who was part of a team that did this amazing research, I think she's from UQ, that looked at the work patterns of the domestic load of women as they started earning more money and then as they became the primary breadwinners in households. And it's so crazy that they had to like absolutely go back and recheck their data again and again because it seemed to be a uniquely Australian pattern. But here's the way it works. From a sort of zero start, as a woman earns every 1% that she earns of the total household income, as it climbs per 1%, she relinquishes on average about 15 minutes of housework. So like, I think it's, I could be getting the numbers a bit wrong, but, so that she's doing less and less and less housework as her income climbs, up until the point where she is earning 66% of the total household income, i.e. she's become, by a small margin, the primary breadwinner, and then her housework hours start to climb again. It's like a U curve like this. I've written about it in The Wife Drought. It's amazing. And it is an Australian phenomenon, and it is the best explanation they can find is that by being the primary breadwinner, the woman is violating a kind of a deep-seated presumption about how she'll behave as a woman, and so she compensates for it by picking up other stuff. And that explains... Wow. I could see like 100 or 200 people just going, do I do that? I don't know. And it was funny, when I was writing that, I was thinking, oh my God. And then I was thinking about the previous week when I had was going away for work and I compensated by baking until like midnight and packing lunches, even when, my partner knows how to pack lunches, and I'm thinking, oh my God, right, yeah.
We are so pathetically guilt-driven.
It's so funny. Anyway, I probably haven't answered anything useful about your friend, I'm sorry, but it's a complicated field and it's full of really fascinating sort of cocktails of what do I want to do, what's easiest for us, what does my partner want to do, and then what do our broader family think we should do? Because often when this happens, like the biggest resistance comes from immediate family saying, oh, why are you doing that? Oh, don't you want to be with your kid, or isn't it going to damage his career, or, all of that stuff all sort of blends in.
I think it is an important point though, because, in the same way that there's a sort of discrimination potentially against men who want to be with their children in a weird way, there's a very strong discrimination against women who don't so much.
Or want to go back to work,
right.
Yeah. Or do go back, yeah. And there's a great Canadian study that's that looks at the experience of caregiving dads, non-caregiving dads, caregiving mums and non-caregiving mums in the workplace. And what they discover is that it's not really your gender that gets you into trouble with this stuff. It's the violation of what people expect you to do. So what they found in this study is so interesting and really revelatory, and for me actually represents the spread of experience across the genders, not just concentrating on, the bad things that happen to women at work. What they found was that the people who did not get a hard time in the workplace were non-caregiving dads and caregiving mums, because they were behaving the way everybody expected. But the ones who got the real kind of really? Were the men who worked differently to look after their kids, and the women who didn't. They were the ones that got the harassment and the, funny looks and everything.
Brutal.
I think that is changing. If you don't mind me just saying, I actually work for a company that has flexible working hours.
Yep.
And I think the culture with companies like that doing what they do, where it's flexible working hours, I see a lot more men leaving early. There's a lot more gender equality between men and women working, and men dropping off the kids to school or picking them up and going, no, I've got to leave at 5 o'clock, I've got to pick the kids up.
Yeah, and I've talked about a couple of, Medibank is a great example of a company that's, when they were privatised in 2014, they moved buildings, and so they took the opportunity to move to flexible working. So one of the most powerful disincentives for people, leaving early or arriving late or whatever to deal with kids is that sort of eyeballs as you walk in and as you walk out, this feeling of being scorched by the stares of people who are like, but I'll be still at work at 10 p.m, but like, And so, but by hot desking, you kind of like remove that. And the example that I use in the essay of how Medibank's managed to change their pattern is based on their decision to go to flexible work and then to incorporate a parental leave model that abolishes any mention of primary carer. It just says, okay, so if a kid's come into your life because you've pushed it out personally, or you've been intimately involved in its creation, or you've adopted or fostering or whatever, then you get 14 weeks full pay, and you can take that all in one chunk or two chunks, or you can just work a 3-day week until it's gone, or a 4-day week or whatever. And that has been what has finally tipped their participation by men. So they introduced it 18 months ago, at which point about 2% of the people taking paid parental leave, like long paid parental leave, were men. And over that short time, it's gone up to about 30%. Because it's been allowed. Specifically, they're invited to be part of it, and they can structure it any way they like. So,
hi, Annabel.
Hello.
My name's Elise. Can I
Hi,
just
Elise.
reach this?
Oh, you've got the short person thing. I feel your pain.
My question's around paid caring industry remuneration levels, which tend to be, as you touched on earlier, not highly valued in Australia and is factoring into the Australian gender wage gap.
Sure. Yep.
So I was just wondering your thoughts around that, of how we get those wages up and or increase diversity in those paid caring roles.
Well, how do you attract people to an industry that is structurally underpaid? It's sort of one of those impossible asks, right? Like, so there's really, there's a policy side about what a minimum wage should be in that field, and then there's a cultural side about, well, why are we underpaying this labour? Why do we undervalue it? Because we are accustomed to other people doing it for free, right? Like, it's, and I think that all of these issues are connected. You can't legislate to change people's sense of how valuable work is. The only way you can really convey how important and valuable work with children is, for instance, is if you've done a bit of it yourself. Then you tend to really get the feel for how important it is, right? And also how hard it is. So I think that if you increase, as I talk about, the involvement of fathers with very young children, you build a base of understanding and respect, but you also change the way that labour is divided down the track. I'm sorry, I wish I had an easier answer for you. I really do.
Yeah, structurally change everything
is
the answer.
Start again.
Over here, please.
Hello, my name is Monica. I'm really interested in the idea that at the moment everyone talks about 12 months off as being a goal or the mainstream idea for how much time somebody should be caring for a child. I wonder, what do people think about how long a child should be cared for, like from the child's point of view?
Well, children need to be cared for even after that, like that's the weird thing. Like, and you often hear people say, well, what about breastfeeding? A man's not going to breastfeed, is he? And I'm not arguing that men can breastfeed, nor am I arguing that, that everything should be 50-50 or whatever. I'm arguing that people should be able to make long-term plans for the care of their children that allows everyone to do what they can and want to do. Like, I actually think a great model is each parent having 6 months. I think that's an awesome model. maybe that's because the way that we first did it when we had our first baby, and it worked incredibly well. And it was sort of really only available because we were sort of moving between countries. Like, it was just sort of miraculous, really, that it kind of panned out the way that it did. But, I mean, in my family, that's led to a really great recognition from both of us about what's involved. Like, nobody thinks that if you're at home, you're bludging. We probably more think that if you're at work, you're bludging, actually. That's the way it's like, off you go to work then. Go get yourself a coffee, why don't you? Have lunch. That's what's like. I used to be so... with our second child, and I was home with, this non-sleeping child, and I'd be like, I wish I could go into a coffee shop with both my hands, I wish I could eat something that wasn't just crackers. Anyway.
Use cutlery.
Yeah. So, look, I don't know. I mean, but I'm not going to be prescriptive about the way other people live their lives. I just think that at the moment there are restrictions. There are cultural restrictions that stop men feeling able to do the sensible thing with work and family, which is to go like the clappers when you can, ease back when you have to, and feel like you've got some control over your life. And that's actually just a sensible human thing to do. But we're sort of in this place where we think it's a sensible lady thing to do.
Yeah.
And we're kind of surprised when men do it. And that actually feeds into this, I think, really unfair perception of fathers. How it's, if you stood up in some, accountancy firm and just said, women are really shit at adding up, you'd be escorted round to the Equal Opportunity Commission within, seconds. But it's perfectly all right to stand around at the school gate and say, I wouldn't get my husband to pack the lunches, it'd be all useless. Or oh, no, I wouldn't get him to do the washing because he's rubbish at it.
And meanwhile, the husband's going, sweet.
Yeah, I know, right? So there is such a thing as sort of maternal gatekeeping, which is a very awkward thing for women to confront sometimes.
But I think
truthfully, if you can't whine about not getting a hand if you're constantly, get away, I'll do that. I mean...
But it does come down to efficiencies, and the point that you were making earlier that that when men typically are excluded from the early lives of their children, the women develop efficiencies in this, and so if it's 9:30 at night, the baby can't get settled. The mum can settle the baby.
Oh, I'll do it. I know how to do it.
Exactly. I mean, like that decision. Just you just want the baby to go to sleep, and the most efficient way to do that is the way
to learn how to do it and to be there for a bit of learning. So. This guy, Derek Rotondo, is the guy who sued JP Morgan Chase. He took long parental leave with the birth of his second child, and he said, I just worked out, it turns out I'm really good at settling babies. I'm awesome at it.
So
and
good.
just think,
this
maybe
is the thing, how many untapped...
Maybe you would just never have found that out.
Right.
Yeah.
So we have time for 2 more questions. Over there, please.
Hello. Annabel, thank you very much for your quarterly essay. I'm going to admit that I didn't finish reading it on the train on the way here.
That's okay.
So apologies.
Something amazing happens at the end.
Apologies. Well, maybe this question's answered, so I'm really sorry if it has been. So I'm really interested in this idea about men get a sense of identity and well-being from being with their kids, and I think that's really important and really, really valuable. And we know that older men in particular, when they finish work, there's a real sense of loss for a lot of men, and that's actually one of the ages at which men are more likely to spiral into depression and experience suicide. Do we know anything about how being with their kids and being with their families actually benefits them in older age?
Well, I haven't got specific research on longevity or anything like that, but there is a really significant phenomenon with men who have identified themselves as breadwinners and as employees or leaders or whatever for their whole lives. They get to the point where they retire, and because they haven't really done anything but work, it feels like not only that life is empty, but also their identity is kind of expired in some way. And I think that even though for women, oh God, it's not super easy to combine work and family when you're doing 1.8 times the amount of domestic work on average that that men are in Australia, but it makes you really good at toggling back and forth. And one of the hidden advantages of that work-wise as well, and I understand this really deeply from my own experience. I mean, I've changed the way that I work every time I've had a baby, basically, because, like, I finished up at newspapers because, you know, newspapers and babies get sort of tired and emotional at exactly the same time of the day. It's just like impossible to, it's hard to do both. So I started working online and, you know, doing different stuff. And for me, having an enforced, you know, even if it's just a couple of months out of the workforce when I have a baby, it's actually really important thinking time about, like, because sometimes when you're in your job, stopping what you're doing for a bit is an amazing thing because it gives you distance. You know, like we're getting stuck in this work track and you think, oh, I'm generally pretty miserable, I don't know what it is, back to work again, you know. And that is, you know, when you are forced to stop, you're like, oh, I hate that job. I want to do something else. And for women, because of the way we work things, you get that opportunity, you know, because childbirth kind of, if you have a baby...
It's a punctuation mark.
It's a punctuation mark. Whereas for men, it's only really being made redundant that ever provides that sort of... And it used to be conscription, but we don't do that anymore. But, you know...
At the moment,
so they're the things. So, you know, I actually think having a bit of distance from your job is quite an enriching thing. And also by the end of your working life, you're good at multitasking.
Okay, last question.
Thanks, Annabel. You talked a bit about how we're seeing a change in white-collar firms.
Yep.
Could you say anything more about what we see in blue-collar firms and other parts of the economy where maybe there's different economic structure, it's harder for people to take unpaid leave and that sort of thing?
Well, there's some companies like Telstra, for instance, that have a white-collar and blue-collar workforce, and they've rolled out all roles flex across all of the parts of the workforce and are getting, I believe, a good response. I think that particularly in smaller companies that employ blue-collar workers, there is a reticence there's a feeling that it's quite hard to install a kind of like a flexible work system. I think that the award system is not, I think it could go further to empower people to avail themselves of flexible work. At the moment, the Fair Work Act says that employers are, that employees have the right to request flexible work. Now, it's not the right to get it, it's the right to request it. So, and that's been reinterpreted quite recently, whereby there is now an obligation on employers to provide reasons if they reject a request for flexible work. But like there's, you know, I write in the essay about this really quite heartbreaking story from a couple of years ago in a Sydney hospital, I think it was Liverpool Hospital. Two painters, the Zammit brothers, both employed as painters at this hospital, and they, for 8 years, had been structuring their shifts so that they'd start at, I think, 6 a.m. and finish at 2:30, so that they could then pick up their kids from school. Now, they were not high-paid workers, their wives also worked, so being able to collect the kids from school really made their work-life stress, you know, manageable. And then the hospital had this sort of...
Efficiency drive
where they said to improve patient outcomes and whatever, we're going to make everything more regulated. So you're not allowed to start early and finish early anymore. You'll be starting at 7 and finishing at 3:30. And they were like, come on, for reals? Like, we just want to pick up our kids. We're not slacking off. No. And so it went all the way to the tribunal, and they had a 4-day hearing, and in the end, the right of the hospital to set the work hours of these guys was upheld. And so, and, you know, they made the point, or their union made the point, that there were, you know, female admin staff who were able to flexibly structure their days to account for their family responsibilities, but it somehow was just sort of weird and not on for these guys to do the same thing. And I just think that, yeah, that was a really heartbreaking example for me, and I think that a more perceptive approach to regulation and enforcement could only be a good thing.
It is cultural shift at the end of the day.
Yep.
Well, look, we're out of time, but our friends at Glebe Books are going to be selling copies of the quarterly essay in the foyer after this. Annabel will be signing them. So if you wanted to purchase one, I encourage you to do so. And thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you very much for missing out on the sunshine. And thank you.